What stands out to me as one of the most important things any video game can do for its own self-interest in regards to gripping and securing a player's time is to have an amazing opening. Honing in more specifically to the platforming genre, this means the first level. It's quite literally unavoidable to have a first level, but it's something every legacy title needs to nail to keep the player invested. This relatively short part of the overall game should serve to aid the new player in many different aspects. But instead of listing them all out, let's analyze one of the very best openers. Now, I've played a lot of platformers in my day, but even so, there are plenty that are still high on my to-do list, so it feels a bit contentious to say it is the absolute best, but gosh dang it, the original Donkey Kong Country has one of the greatest opening levels of any platformer, and here's why. Jungle Hijinx, the level that kicked off a new age of Donkey Kong within the 16-bit era. You already know you're in for quite a treat when you are first greeted by Donkey Kong busting out of his house. Most levels and just about every platformer fades in on the character standing around waiting for the player to take action. It makes this exciting, a small detail that goes a big way. This tiny action gives the player a hint of Donkey's motivation. He is pissed off and ready to throw down, but with what exactly? In a genre where the story is usually put on the back burner on the checklist of things that platformers need to deliver on, Donkey Kong Country gives the player an amazing, keyword, optional look into the story. See, after being able to take control of Donkey, the player is given 3 different options for which direction to head towards. Going into the cave on Donkey's left, we get a glimpse into the plot of the game. This 7-second cutscene is more than enough to understand what's at stake. This cave is actually the Kong's banana hoard, and if it visually being empty wasn't telling enough, the dramatic music and Donkey's depressed head shakes should fill the player with enough empathy and even anger to fulfill a motivation to beat the game and rescue those bananas. This excellent design choice gives the player more control over how much or how little they want to experience from such a dislocated part of the game's core strengths. An even more optional path is to venture back upwards into DK's house. The game rewards the player for being explorative with an extra life balloon. What is even better than an extra life, however, is the tire on the ground that you can play around with. Trust me when I say it is mindless fun just to jump around on this thing, not to mention the world building. By being able to go into DK's house, we get a sense of the Kong's love of bananas, as well as Donkey's love for Candy Kong through the picture of her on the wall. We can infer that they are indeed in a relationship without even reading it in the manual. The best thing about this area, and what impresses me to no end, is how this incredibly small shark sprite within the painting on the wall moves around. Rare had no business coding this in, but it's there, and that perfectly represents Rare in their prime. Going right and moving on to the actual level. The first challenge of any first level should be an easy and open way to learn and experience the combat system of the game. This is necessary in order to defend yourself over whatever the game classifies as the enemy. DKC's first attempt is in the form of the wonderfully beautiful fodder of a single Naughty. Now, before we dive into this, let me present a concept of why enemy placement in 2D design is oftentimes more impactful compared to 3D design. Given the nature of 2D space, it should be obvious that the options of movement for both the player's character and any obstacles exist on the same plane. Compare this to a 3D space where the options are vastly added upon, since there is now movement in full 360-degree motion. If we apply this to basic enemy placement, in 3D titles it is oftentimes easy to be given the option to not even interact with the threat at hand. You can just simply walk another direction and find an altered path to your goal. However, in 2D titles, a simple fodder enemy becomes much more intimate with the player, because they are oftentimes forced to have an interaction with them, whether it be going above, below, or through the enemy. You cannot just walk around them and find a new path like you often can in a 3D space. Getting back to Jungle Hijinx and the progression of difficulty to properly teach the player of the basic enemies. Like I've already pointed out, the first challenge is a single naughty. These guys are simply fodder. They move strictly forward and at a slow pace, which is perfectly fine to get the player comfy with the combat. Notice how there's a stretch of level before you approach the naughty, just in case the player is not confident in fighting him right away and is still getting used to the controls. This space gives ample time to let the player decide on which of the three options to do in order to beat the naughty. Jump over it, jump on its head, or roll through it. The game then introduces a DK barrel, aka Diddy Kong. Not only are DK barrels a core concept of the game, but allowing an extra hit will give the player a small margin for error, which will be appreciated since the rest of the level features challenges composed of multiple enemies at once. Next up is the first encounter with a member of the Kremling army, a critter. Much like the naughties, these guys are the most basic and easy to deal with in regards to the different types of Kremlings, which is fitting since our first critter is paired with a single naughty. At first glance, it would be much easier to take the lower path that you are already traversing and take out the naughty to continue, but the game bribes the player to take the upper path and face the critter by placing the first Kong letter above the elevated platform. The critters have no tricks up their sleeves. In fact, the only difference between them and a naughty is their taller hitbox. Moving on, we can say goodbye to our naughty friends for now, because up ahead are two critters on individual raised platforms. The challenge here is not getting caught off guard by the critters falling off the platform. The game pulls a fast one on the player by having the previous critter pace back and forth without falling off. Also, the two critters platforms are a lot shorter than the single critters from before, so attacking them will require a more thought-provoking attempt. Finally, to wrap up the first half of the level and the final batch of enemies, we have two clumps trotting down the path not too far behind one another. Here we see our first example of a stronger Kremling type, which leads to showcasing the power difference between Donkey and Diddy. Mario's tactics won't work out so well against the clumps, for they brought along helmets. I suppose the critters didn't get the memo. Jumping on them with Diddy will prove worthless. We need Donkey for the job. Rolling through the clumps with either Kong works fine, but it is important to demonstrate the different skill sets between the two playable Kongs, especially when you start running into tougher enemies further down the game, such as the Crushes, which, speaking from physical moves, only takes a jump on the head from Donkey to be defeated. We've reached the second half of the level and have conquered basic combat training. Don't get too excited just yet, for the greatest threat Jungle Hijinx has in store is upon us. A Neki throwing rocks down a 3-layered set of platforms. This Neki is a bit different than the naughties and Kremlings, for its main attack is a projectile. If you wish to defeat it, you're going to have to make your way up to the top of the platforms and either jump on it or roll through it. If the rocks are making it a little too tricky, there is an empty barrel on the ground to crash the Neki with. While it would be safer to scurry along the bottom path past the Neki, the game yet again tries to coax the player into fighting it by placing an animal token right beneath the Neki. The level then switches the pace up by giving us our first introduction to animal buddies, with the most prominent helper, Rambi. To properly show off Rambi's destructive capabilities over the Kongs, 3 rather poor naughties are placed in succession only to be easily trampled by Rambi. At first glance, the level continues on with another set of 3 enemies, but this time the critters are the victims. But with the usage of our animal buddy, we get an insight to another core concept of DKC, bonus rooms. By crashing into the wall and hearing a special jingle, the game tries to notify the player that this isn't some sort of shortcut through the level. It's made even more clear with the upbeat music, a buttload of bananas, and an extra life that this is a bonus room. Entering these can be done in a number of ways, but it's nice to be introduced to them in such an easy way that most players would find it hard not to find this on their first playthrough. After a single clump and a jump over a bottomless pit, Jungle Hijinx promptly comes to an end. Just as you creep your way to the exit, the sun sets and the night falls onto DK Isle. This is much more than a simple flex from the Super Nintendo's capabilities. Now, this technically leaves the context of Jungle Hijinx itself, but I must point out how this nightfall ending to the level beautifully transitions into the second level, Ropey Rampage. The night has climaxed into a thunderstorm only to come full circle at the end, where daytime yet again comes upon the land. You may think that's all there is to Jungle Hijinx, but there is more to this level than first meets the eye. Remember when I said the player had 3 options at the beginning of the level? I lied. There's actually a 4th option, going to the upper right to travel through the treetops. A new player may not have even known you can get up there from the start, and this is reflected by the game rewarding those curious cats who did make their way up there with not 1, not 2, but 4 extra lives. That is, assuming that you can make it all the way across without falling. It's a bit tricky. Continuing on, there's a second bonus room located right after you exit the first one. Now, this one is a lot easier to miss. You could use Rambi to bust through the wall again, but in case you lost him, there is a barrel hidden in a patch of dirt that you must jump on from the treetop above to expose it. The game actually teaches you about these hidden barrels earlier in the level while taking the more advanced treetop path. Towards the beginning, there's this very hard to miss arrow made of bananas pointing downwards, which just so happens to expose a hidden steel barrel. The player can use this same knowledge as well as the first bonus room lesson to discover this second bonus room. In conclusion, Jungle Hijinx on the surface may seem like your typical jungle level, which is all too common throughout Donkey Kong Country, but I propose that it's something special. It teaches the newly acquainted player a lot of core concepts that will be used throughout the entire game, while also just plain out being a super fun level to play. But I mean, that's DKC in a nutshell for ya. I didn't even mention the music. Jungle Groove has to be one of the best opening themes to, like, anything ever. The gradual build up to the main part of the song is just legendary. Enough said.